So for this meetup detail page, I'll add a new functional component inside of that meetup ID page, the meetup details component, and I'll then export this as a default. Whoops, like this, not meetup list, like this, and then here we return the content for the meetup details page. Now here it's of course up to you how you want to display the details for a given item. I will output a fragment, which we need to import from React, so that we can have multiple adjacent JSX elements. And I'll then start by outputting the image of that meetup item with some source and some alt text. Now, of course, later we will actually get the concrete data for a specific meetup item here. At the moment, we don't really have any meetup data source. We have this dummy array in the root index.js file, but it's only available in there. And whilst we could export this constant and then also use it in the meetup detail page, I will not do this here because we're soon going to connect a real backend anyways. And therefore, for the moment, I'll just hard code some data in here. And I'll grab that data from the dummy data though, so from this dummy meetups array, and I'll copy the image link here and use that as a source. And the alt text could be first meetup like this. Then below that, I will add a h1 tag where I say first meetup. And then below that, a paragraph with the meetup description. We can also add an address element here, which is a default HTML element where we have the address. Like that. That could be how we output the meetup details for the moment with some dummy data. And if I add this here in the meetup details component, if we reload this meetup details page, this is what we see. And that's okay, but of course not the final style which I'd like to have. I'd like to center all the text actually, and I would also like to shrink the image a little bit. Now for that I haven't prepared any styles, so we can just quickly add some styles together here. And for this I'll actually add a brand new component in the components meetups folder, which I'll name meetup detail, like this. And you don't have to create this component. I just like to keep my page component files pretty lean and outsource as much JSX code as possible into standalone components, but that is not something you have to do. Nonetheless, I will do it here, and I'll copy that fragment from the meetup details page component here and add it to the meetup detail single component and create that meetup detail component here. And of course also export meetup detail here and return that JSX code here then like this. And actually accept props already and expect that I get this data through props now, so that the data will be fetched in the page component later and will then be passed into this component, which is then responsible for actually presenting the content. So here we then have props.image. Here for alt, we could use props.title. What we then also use here for the h1 tag, props.title. And here for the address, that would be props.address. And here we have the description, props.description. And on the meetup details page component, we can now output this meetup detail component we just worked on. And for this, of course, import this meetup detail component up there. And now we just need to pass that data, which we expect in that component, through props into that meetup detail component. So here we can then add the image prop and then use our dummy image link or our dummy image content here for the moment. Set the title prop, first meetup could be the title. Set the address prop to some street, 5, some city, and last but not least, set the description prop to this is a first meetup. And then we can get rid of the fragment and that JSX content in the page component and just use the meetup detail component here. Now, why am I doing that? Again, just to keep the JSX code lean here, and now also for styling reasons. We could have also imported a CSS file in the page component. This would work. It is a regular component after all. But I like to keep my pages folder lean and only have the page.js files in there. Now, for the other components, on the other hand, it is quite common that we pair a JavaScript file with a CSS file. And again, we could have done that in the pages folder as well, but I want to keep that folder leaner. Here for the components folder, it is more common to include these CSS files, and hence here I'll now also add a meetup_detail.module.css file. The .module.css is important, by the way. We already used it all the time here, silently, so to say, because I provided all these components to you, but this actually unlocks a feature called CSS modules. It's a feature which you might know from standard React. It allows you to scope CSS class styles to a React component, and it is supported out of the box in Next.js projects. If you name a CSS file like this, ending with .module.css, and you then import it into your JavaScript file in a certain way, which I'll show you in a second, then the CSS styles defined in the CSS file will be scoped to this component, at least if you use CSS classes as selectors. Now, that special way of importing can be seen in the other JavaScript files. It looks like this. We import classes, or however you want to name it, from the CSS file. And that's a special way of importing, which will be picked up by Next.js, and behind the scenes it will then transform the CSS classes so that the class names are unique per component. And that ensures that your styles can't spill over to other components. That's why I also wanted to show you this approach here. So now we can import classes from /meetupdetail.module.css like this. And now classes is a JavaScript object in the end, where any CSS classes you define in your CSS file will be available as properties on this object. And if you access them, the values will be the transformed CSS files, which are guaranteed to be unique. And that allows you to use the same CSS class names in different components without clashing with the styles. And now we could replace fragment here with section and give that section a class name of classes.detail, let's say, like this. And if we do that, we can now add a detail CSS class here in the meetup.detail.module CSS file. And the styles we define in there will then be applied to this section because it gets this transformed detail class under the hood. And that is a nice feature to have, which is why I also wanted to show it to you. Now with that, we can, for example, select the image, which is inside of that element with the detail class. So this image, we can select this and then change its look, change its style. For example, give it a width of 100%, which ensures that it stays in the box that is reserved for this page by the layout component. We can also select the overall detail class again, so the entire section with that class on it, and set text align to center, so that all the text elements are centered. And that could now be our detail page. Of course, you can tweak it. You can add more styles. You can make sure that it looks the way you want it to look. I don't want to turn this into a CSS course. I just wanted to show you this CSS modules feature and show you this approach which you don't have to use, but which I like to use, that I keep my page component files relatively lean, especially regarding the JSX code, and I instead use embeddable standard React components for the actual JSX code, and, like in this case, for the styling. And with that, we have our detail page in place, and now we got all these pages here which we need. Now with that, we can work towards replacing that dummy data source, our dummy array here in the root index.js file, with a real backend, with a real data source.